All that reading went to hell. Yes, well, anyway, I did it again. Distributional perspective, there is indeed a unifying element among economic rents. Rising rents increase the cost structure of the economy, and in doing so, typically burden value producing firms and households. This has a distributional effect and growth effect. To demonstrate the distributional conflict between the value creation oriented firms and rentier oriented firms and households at the macro level, we use a Kalecki-inspired aggregate markup pricing framework as follows. That is, final goods price level equals markup and overheads. In practice, firms charge a price markup over their total expenditure on overheads, which typically includes core costs, wages, land, energy, and financial payments, and in modern industries, a payment for patents and digital platform fees. This markup multiplied by the quantity sold minus the distribution cost is their retained profit. Overheads have differing price elasticities. Wages depend on the bargaining power of workers, which is usually lower than that of employers, and salaries tend to be easy to freeze or squeeze. In contrast, the overheads related to inherently scarce resources that are necessary for production, i.e., energy, oil, gas, and coal, land and raw materials, are related to sectors that have created artificial monopoly type conditions, such as the banking sector, and industries protected by strong patent legislation tend to be inelastic. Firms in these rentier sectors are in a position to raise prices and increase the overhead on the productive sectors of the economy and thus increase their share of income disproportionately to the value they've created. Consequently, deriving unearned income within the production process can be either due to the possession of a necessary resource or due to certain legal rights. Given this, the price markup is firstly determined by the balance of power between capital and labor. Economies with more organized labor markets can push down the markup and increase real wages and vice versa. Alternatively, as Kalecki notes, advertising promotion spending may allow a firm to increase its markup by steering consumers toward its product and away from competitors. This enables the firm to increase its markup above the average markup of the market. That will indeed increase the average final goods price level in the economy. The emergence of digital platforms has somewhat complicated these dynamics. In contemporary capitalism, traditional advertising, access to information about products and services, and also the circulation of the products themselves are becoming increasingly digitalized, at least in most advanced economies. As we explore in section 3.5, this has given digital platforms substantial power over traditional firms due to their control of the circulation and information spheres, enabling them to manipulate consumer choice. They can extract a proportion of the markup as rent in return for the right to use their platforms and or have producers' products promoted on their platforms. On the other hand, the emergence of digital platforms like Amazon, who offer a full range of warehouse and product distribution services, allows firms to cut some traditional overheads. Typically, such services enable them to decrease land rents and the wage bill since they no longer rely on physical stores and salespeople. However, platforms still typically charge a payment for use of their platform, and this payment, whilst possibly initially lower than previous overheads, will become more inelastic the more the platform company is able to dominate a sector. In addition, more traditional firms start using such services, the more power platforms gain vis-a-vis damn it, excuse me, vis-a-vis these firms and the wider value creating sectors of the economy. This means that they can increase the rent extracted for their services, which eventually will raise overhead costs. Thus, the total rent income share in the economy. Given the framework presented above, we can distinguish between three potential scenarios for how rentierization affects the macro economy. Scenario one, Underconsumption-driven slowdown in accumulation. In an economy with flexible labor markets and a high degree of labor substitution, such as the UK or the US, a rise in overhead costs driven by increasing rents can be counterbalanced by reducing wages. In the short term, the firm remains competitive. That is, its sales do not fall and keeps its profit margin unchanged. That keeps retained profits at the same level and thus the available funds for investment and innovation. However, in the medium term, consumption will decline with declining wages, and with it, effective demand and the incentive for long term investment and innovation, triggering an underconsumption driven slowdown in accumulation. Now, this argument has been made in relation to the financialization of corporate governance in the US as a root cause for rising inequality. As wages fell and consumer demand fell, firms increasingly used their profits to invest in short-term financial returns. For example, share buybacks to maintain their share prices. Here we extend this rationale to a wider range of rents and not only financial payments. Scenario 2 is profit squeeze-driven slowdown in accumulation. A rise in overheads related to rents in an economy with a low degree of labor substitution, for example, in a regulated labor market with low cost of job loss, low underemployment, and low unemployment, does not allow industrial capitalists to counterbalance this rise by squeezing wages. Instead, their only short-term option to keep their prices stable and not exit their sector is to limit their profit margins. In this case, in the short term, the firm remains competitive, but its profit margin drops. That leads to less retained profits and thus less available funds for investment and innovation, triggering a profit squeeze-driven slowdown in accumulation. Therefore, as in the first scenario, rising rents in seemingly competitive product markets with relatively stable prices eventually lead to economic stagnation and macroeconomic instability. Scenario 3, taming the competition in the product market. Mainstream theory typically assumes that rising prices will eventually lead the firm with higher prices to exit the sector and the most price-effective ones to survive, assuming perfect information or transitory information asymmetries among consumers and producers. Nevertheless, the question is whether a firm can survive with a higher price, i.e., with stable profit margins and wages given the rising overheads. The digitalization of modern commercial trade may enable a firm to do this in the short term by influencing consumers' access to information on product differentiation and prices in its sector. Typically, however, as discussed in section 3.5, this involves an increase in rents paid to a digital platform. Now, eventually, this can become unsustainable as paying additional rents further worsens the financial position of the firm in the long run. A parallel theoretical analysis can be applied to households outside the aforementioned wage dynamics. The spending power of households, and thus consumption spending, is a function of their living costs, some of which will be to rentier sectors, most obviously energy and heating, shelter, and transport. Now, since these cannot be easily substituted, rising costs in these sectors will result in falling consumption in more elastically priced sectors with knock-on effects in demand. Typically, the more elastically priced sectors will be value-creating, real economy sectors, hence the sales in these sectors will drop. These effects are macroeconomically significant given that consumption makes up the majority of GDP in most advanced economies. Now, this has been brought into sharp focus with the recent COVID-19 epidemic. Rising rents will also raise relative income inequality since these sectors typically take up a larger fraction of poorer households' outgoings. In summary, rentier-dominated economies are prone to stagnation. Sooner or later, rising rents will lead to a slowdown in accumulation and a crisis, either due to higher income and wealth inequality and the resulting decline in effective demand, or due to a squeeze in the profits of productive firms, or both. In practice, it's likely that rentierization will simultaneously hurt retained profits, investment, and wages, with the distribution of the burden depending on the balance of power between labor and capital. Number four, mapping modern economic rents across different sectors. Now, in this section, we employ the framework just outlined to examine how rentier-related overhead costs have become larger during the last decades, burdening the productive sectors of the economy and households. Our analysis is based on both descriptive evidence and discussion of relevant policy developments over the last decades. Whilst given the space constraints, the case studies here are far from comprehensive. We hope they can provide a roadmap for future sectoral level research on rent extraction models, which will inform policies that could reshape these sectors and form the basis for a more inclusive, innovation led, and sustainable economy. 4.1 Modern Land and Finance Rents. The original source of rent identified by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx was land. Ricardo claimed that as the economy grows, more land must be used. And land is, by definition, the scarcest factor of production. Landowners steadily gain bargaining power, able to charge whatever workers and capitalists can afford to pay. In this respect, land returns become rents, as they do not correspond to the landowner's contribution to production, but to their monopolistic position. As land rents rise relative to incomes and the overall growth of the economy, firms and households will be forced to reduce wages and investment and consumption, respectively. Hence, rising land rents can be seen as a case of scenario one or scenario two, depending on the structure of the labor market, as outlined in section 3. However, land rents today are more complex than at the time the classicals were writing. The growth of widespread homeownership in the 20th century beyond wealthy elites constituted democratization of land rents as more of the middle class enjoyed wealth gains on their property. But for the last 40 years, house prices, largely driven by land values, have risen at a much faster rate than incomes and consumer prices in nearly all advanced economies. And levels of homeownership have plateaued and indeed began to fall in many advanced economies. Now, the consequence has been increasing rentier returns to land and homeowners in the form of both rising ground rents and capital gains, a housing affordability crisis in many cities, and increasingly large household debts as citizens are forced to borrow more to buy a property. Policy has supported this process. Taxes on land and increasing property values have been reduced relative to other types of financial assets and other forms of tenure, as homeownership has become an expectation in advanced economies, making property a highly desirable asset to store and accrue wealth. In addition, from the 1980s onward, deregulation of the banking sector has seen a huge expansion in mortgage lending that has driven up land values and house prices. Indeed, most bank lending in advanced economies involves lending against or trading existing assets rather than financing the creation of new productive assets. Now, figure 1 below shows how in the 1990s, advanced economy mortgage lending, that is commercial and domestic, overtook non-mortgage lending, that is the majority of which is business lending, to reach 70% of GDP, up from about 20% in the 1950s, with house prices following a similar trajectory. In the UK, for example, only around 10% of all bank lending supports non-financial firm investment, with the rest funding real estate or financial asset purchases, pumping up the prices of these assets in the process. And here is the figure 1, which shows private debt ratios and the real house price index on the right axis. As property and land prices increase, households and firms need to borrow more to afford them, increasing the demand for mortgage credit further and creating a positive feedback cycle. The interest paid out by households and firms on these ever larger mortgages can be seen as a form of rent, since nothing new or productive is being created out of having higher land and house prices. Now, these assets could be provided at the same quality at a lower cost to society. The result is a fall in demand as homeowners' spending power is reduced as more of their income is taken up in rising mortgage interest or ground rent payments. Similar dynamics have occurred in the corporate real estate market, although this has been more cyclical and volatile in general. In this case, rising corporate land rents obviously increase the overhead costs for the firm with knock-on effects in wages and demand. Institutional investor finance has also been channeled into real estate via the creation of mortgage-backed securities and related financial innovations. Again, in most cases, this has just served to further inflate existing land values rather than support any form of productive activity. These innovations were made possible by financial deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s, driven by the desire to secure higher levels of home ownership as well as financial sector lobbying. This market was co-shaped by policy decisions. How then might we identify these rents to enable more enlightened, value-creating policy decisions? Disaggregating bank lending into loans that are more productive and less productive, and then calculating the interest and fees to these different sectors is one option. Productive could be defined to include all non-financial business lending. For example, following the distinction used by central banks and by a number of recent studies, which have analyzed the effect of bank lending on growth and financial instability. Once identified, policy could seek to disincentivize non-productive lending. For example, loans for the purchase of existing housing, and incentivize business lending, for example, via forms of credit guidance and control. But as noted in section 3.3 above, I think, an increasing proportion of non-financial lending is used for the purchase of financial assets, including share buybacks and mergers and acquisitions. So further disaggregation that examines what non-financial firms do with bank loans would ideally be needed. Beyond the financial sector, reforms to the land market itself to reduce the speculative, that is, the rentier demand for properties are required. It is notable that despite the general tendency of rising land rents and house prices, there are exceptions which show that it is possible to provide housing and other forms of shelter at the same quality at a lower cost to society. Some successful advanced economies, Germany, South Korea, and Singapore, have seen house and land price to income ratios remain flat or even fall since the 1980s. Notably, in South Korea and Singapore, land is owned or controlled to a much greater extent by the state. In Singapore, 90% of the land is publicly owned, meaning the land rents are effectively socialized and can be used to support more affordable housing. Germany has much lower levels of private home ownership, around 60%, than the advanced economy average, and greater tenure neutrality with much stronger rights for renters. Notable also in Germany and Korea is the presence of a more diverse banking system. While in countries such as the UK, commercial shareholder banks dominate, in the former, there is a strong public and cooperative banking presence. This includes large state investment banks that lend to sectors aligned with industrial and economic policy goals, as well as cooperative and local banks, where strong relationships with borrowers enable banks to de-risk their lending rather than relying on property-based collateral, as has been the case for shareholder banks. These institutional and policy differences in how the state shapes financial and land markets merit further investigation and understanding how we might reduce land and financial rents and help reverse rising household debt and the consequent drag on consumer demand. 4.2, natural resource rents and climate change. The early classicals defined land in a broad sense, implicitly or explicitly including the ownership of natural resources. A broader definition of land encompasses natural resources, energy, water, carbon sinks, ecosystems that are equally vital for capitalist production and human survival. Unlike land as locational space, which can be reused for different purposes through time. Non-renewable natural resources can be, and indeed are being, exhausted. Thus, ownership of such a scarce resource assigns substantial monopoly power and the opportunity for significant rentier income. Increasing natural resource rents flowing to private actors will indeed increase the overhead costs of production, which, as described in the previous section, are likely to cause a slowdown in accumulation due to either supply or demand side reasons. Natural resources may be a blessing or a curse, depending very much on the interaction between the state and market. Certain countries, such as Norway, have used resource rents to develop sovereign wealth funds that support high levels of public welfare and play a market shaping role in supporting sustainable investment in productive activity. However, for some advanced and many developing countries, the ownership of natural resources in a globalized world has not led to increased welfare, but to rising rents and exploitation. For example, the large oil sector in Africa has been a curse since weak political institutions and globalization have led domestic corporate trusts and multinational corporations to monopolize these rents with minor, if any, economic benefits for domestic populations. Similarly, oil-rich countries in the Middle East have seen the emergence of the rentier state, where a small political elite absorbs the bulk of profits from oil excavation. Thus, the socialization of resource rents is not always the obvious policy solution, since it depends on having well-established political and democratic institutions. Climate rent creates important new questions for how we think about resource rents. An energy company, whether state-owned or private, that generates rentier profits from its control over oil extraction in a particular country could be seen to be extracting value not just from the natural wealth of that country or region in the present, assuming it does not redistribute them in an equitable manner. Simultaneously, it is also reducing the welfare of future generations at an international level since climate change has global impacts. Conversely, rents generated from the production of renewable energy might be seen as highly desirable, in particular in the short term, as a means of supporting the rapid decarbonization of the economy and investment in green energy innovation. Indeed, in countries like Germany, a key part of the successful transition to clean energy has been active government intervention and subsidies for cleaner production in sectors like steel and gas. Rather than blanket policies to reduce natural resource rents, policymakers thus need to direct markets towards more sustainable models where transient rents may be needed in the short term to support innovation. 4.3, shareholder rents, financialization of corporate governance. Since the 1980s, the shift toward shareholder value maximization as the dominant form of corporate governance has led to increasing rents in parts of the non-financial corporate sector. This has become possible through certain legal reforms, which promoted the liberalization of finance and allowed restructuring within the corporate governance system of non-financial firms. Companies are not owned by a single person or small group of industrial capitalists anymore, but by a more diffuse group of shareholders with interests not necessarily aligned with those of the firm's direct management. In particular, modern shareholders, or more precisely, the funds that manage those shares, have come to place a strong emphasis on the short-term value of the company's share price above and beyond long-term investments. This has led to firms' profits being spent on pumping up stock prices via share buybacks and mergers and acquisitions. In the USA, for example, over the decade 2006 to 2017, net equity issues of non-financial corporations averaged $412 billion per year, meaning more money went into the stock market than was taken out. Again, the financial sector played a key role here. A recent study found that more than half of all buybacks in the USA, stock buybacks, are now funded by debt. In effect, this is credit creation for directly inflating financial assets or share prices. The capital gains from increasing stock prices due to share buybacks or mergers and acquisitions activity adds nothing of value to the real economy. It is economic rent. The process runs as follows. Shareholders put pressure on firm managers to keep share prices high since this leads to the maximization of their income from dividend payments. Now, if demand for shares is not sufficient to keep share prices high, firm managers increase corporate debt ratios in order to buy back shares as a means of boosting demand, hence the level of share prices. Accordingly, the distribution of a firm's revenue is divided into number one, dividend payments to the shareholders, number two, corporate debt payments to the commercial banks, and number three, final retained profits. As the financial positions of firms worsens due to the rising corporate debt ratios needed to maintain high share prices and dividend payments, firm managers in countries with flexible labor markets will squeeze wages as a means of decreasing costs. In a similar way, aggressive mergers and acquisitions, often again funded by debt leveraging or private equity takeovers, often involve asset stripping, activities that enhance the short-term efficiency of the firm but involve job losses and wage cuts, as well as increases in debt that ultimately reduce the long-term viability of the firm. Uh, an obtuse example, just to allow for it, is the merger and acquisition of the Pac-12 football conference into both the Big Ten, the ACC, and the Big 12. So it was asset stripping from the point of view of West Coast income from such revenue generating sports. And the increased size and scale did not necessarily compensate, and particularly in a regional way. From a macroeconomic perspective, this results in an additional decrease in consumption and thus in effective demand, investment, and innovation, inducing a steeper value extraction driven slowdown in accumulation. As shown in Figure 2, net dividend payments by non-financial corporations, i.e., the rentier income of shareholders in the USA, have increased rapidly since the 1980s. Simultaneously, the manufacturing expenditure on research and development as a share of GDP has declined sharply since the mid 2000s. That's the left axis. This pattern shows clearly the shift of non-financial firms' objectives from investment and innovation, that is value creation, to rent maximization in the early 21st century. So you can see this divergence here, and it's pretty extreme, as I think you can see. What are the questions shareholder value primacy raises for understanding modern economic rents? Now, to answer this question, we have to look at shareholder rents and corporate banking rents separately. First, shareholder dividends, like land rents, are about extracting value from existing assets. In this case, the company's share price. As noted, these can be increased through share buybacks, funded from either profits, bank borrowing, or the issuance of corporate bonds. Where borrowing occurs, there's clearly a parallel with mortgage debt asset price inflation. Accordingly, debt-fueled dividend payments are indeed rents, as they are a reward without a contribution to the production or the circulation process. See, we're still back to Department 1 and 2. Simultaneously, firms have to decrease their productive spending. For example, long-term investment in R&D expenditures, scenario 2 in section 3, to repay the loans they signed to fuel the shareholder bubble. Thus, they limit further the productive capacity of the economy. Second, corporate banking rents, that is, interest payments on corporate loans, in principle, could either foster or discourage innovation depending on where the credit goes. Now, if firms use debt to fund long-term productive investment, this can support value creation and profitability. In this scenario, interest payments to commercial banks might indeed be seen as the reward to banks for acting patiently and taking risk by investing in long-term investment projects. Now, more research is needed on what non-financial firms actually use bank credit for in advanced economies. Now, that's a whole thing there. 4.4, innovation and patent rents. Schumpeter's notion of technology rents as an incentive for innovation and growth has significant explanatory power for the dynamics of research and development expenditures. New technologies lead to product differentiation and thus to short-term monopolistic gains until the new technology diffuses. Now, what that does is it creates an incentive for other firms to become research and development, R&D, intensive to earn such short-term rents in the future. Hence, innovation fosters competition, which fosters further innovation. Patents are traditionally justified politically as incentivizing the efforts of entrepreneurs by enabling them to appropriate the rewards, those Schumpeterian rents from their innovation. Nevertheless, for patents to stimulate innovation, they should be narrow, that is, limited to the downstream part of the innovation chain relevant to the new innovation, and weak, that is, easily licensable, not strong and wide. I think COVID might have shown some examples of that. Instead, in practice, they're too strong and wide, impeding innovation and leading to what Baumol called unproductive entrepreneurship. Now, that's, an oxymoron, right? According to the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, W-I-P-O, patents are generally granted for a period of 20 years, with the minimum being 14 years for design patents. The average duration of patents is so long that it acts as a disincentive for investment, since once a firm innovates and the patent is granted, it secures income from it for approximately 2 decades. Simultaneously, competitor firms have to pay fees to use these patents, decreasing the funds available for their own research and development expenditures. Thus, we may conclude that much patent income since the mid-1990s is indeed a rent. In this respect, long-lasting patents do not reward long-term investment and innovation, but instead protect those who do not take further risks after they successfully innovate once. Now, according to the rent-seeking theory, patents create rents only if they lead to higher prices. However, clearly, the monopoly rents arising from patents may harm the economy even when prices remain unchanged. Similar to our analysis of natural resource rents, patent payments are part of the economy's overhead costs, although not all firms will, of course, require patented commodities. Therefore, firms can attempt to remain competitive, i.e., not increase their prices by suppressing wages or by decreasing their profit margins. In both cases, this could trigger a slowdown in accumulation and investment, either due to the demand effects of higher inequality or due to less retained profits, given that these get reinvested respectively. As reported in Figure 3, aggregate patent rents have been rising both in the USA and the UK since the early 1990s, but substantially more rapidly in the former. Given this stylized fact, it is key for our understanding of the dynamics of innovation that future research tests whether the patentization of innovation has indeed contributed to stagnation, either by squeezing profit margins or wages. So you can see this divergence here, or at least a comparison between the UK and the US. 4.5, platform capitalism and digital rents. The recent growth of digital platform monopolies and their rising influence over the circulation sphere has raised concerns about rent extraction in the real economy. According to the positive network externalities framework, the larger the number of users in a platform, the lower the price to the consumer should be. In reality, because of important network effects, that is, digital platforms, once they reach a critical size and number of users, experience increasing rather than decreasing marginal returns. Digital platforms act as intermediaries between the producer and the consumer, charging a fee over the final price. Now, while they may aid product circulation in some cases, supporting exchange and economic growth, the fee charged to the producer for access to the platform is non-productive income, as it is determined largely by market power, and it does not add anything to the value of the final product. Now, while the prices of final goods and services may be reduced via digital intermediation and circulation, the more popular a platform becomes, the more it can increase its income share by squeezing producers' income via charging fees and other aggressive policies. In this sense, while consumers may get products at relatively stable or even lower prices, producers' profits may decline, and thus their incentive to reinvest and innovate. Consumers may appear to gain in the short term by having a greater choice on one easy-to-access platform, see it, Amazon, but eventually they may suffer from low quality and diminishing variety of choices as competing firms are forced to exit the market due to falling profits. Platforms like Uber and Lyft, which have become monopolies within their sector, extract approximately 25 to 35% of the total fare on average. Independent professionals have to pay fees to be included in these platforms, since otherwise they will be not able to access sufficient customers to compete in the market. Yet, no ostensible value is added to the economy during these processes. Somewhat paradoxically, the value these platforms create in terms of connecting together users in new networks is not captured in the national accounts, partly because there's nothing to count, since users give up their information free of charge. See Palantir. Thus, the commodification of personal information and thus services in the sharing economy is a source of economic rents. Amazon provides an example of a related form of renterism, acting as an intermediary for companies that do not have the capacity to distribute their own product. Amazon charges a fee to store and ship a company's products from its own warehouses on demand via its sold by Amazon SBA platform. The SBA system also offers an additional service, automatic dynamic price adjustment, i.e., Amazon lowers or increases the price of the goods of certain sellers based on their competitors' pricing decisions in order to keep them competitive. Amazon extracts rent as a fee to join SBA, sold by Amazon, in return for selling its access to data on competitors' pricing strategies and conducting dynamic price adjustment according to this information. Amazon effectively utilizes monopoly power over product distribution and pricing data to provide an additional service as an uncertainty and competition minimizer for those who join, sold by Amazon. Now, that gives us two types of digital rents. Number one, paid for product distribution services, and number two, paid for access to data on competitors' decisions and strategies. Using Amazon's online fees calculator, we find that for a company that sells a total number of 100 products, in our example, books, with an average price of £10, the total amount paid by the customers is £1,400, and the final revenue to the producer is £1,140, leaving Amazon with a rent of 22%, £260. This calculation does not include the monthly subscription fee of £25, excluding VAT per month, the VAT charges, or any other service fees, such as the SBA fees. Simultaneously, Amazon has also itself become a producer for a wide variety of products, which constitutes a major conflict of interest since it has become the product distributor of its own competitors. This allows it to tame competition by charging fees that Amazon itself does not have to pay for its own brand products and extend its monopoly power from the circulation sphere to the product market. See Kindle. This is similar to the algorithmic rent extraction model of Apple's App Store, among others. Another interesting example of digital renterism is Google, which has established a global monopoly on information distribution through the popularity of its search engine and at the same time become a digital advertising monopolist. From a producer's perspective, while being included in Google search results is free, Google charges a fee for promotion to a higher position in the search results. Clearly, such a fee constitutes rent your income, as Google is exploiting its market power to extract payment without offering a specific service other than discriminating between users who pay and users who do not. Again, the ordering work is done via relatively costless algorithms. From a consumer's perspective, productive firms also tend to use such digital services to steer customers in more profitable directions. A typical example is the income foregone by customers who are entitled to free tax filing services, but who do not have sufficient information on their rights. Elliott, in 2019, demonstrates that customers commonly end up paying for expensive tax filing services they do not need, as tax filing companies promote online-specific high-cost services, limiting indirectly the access to essential information on free services. Digital tech companies appear to offer subsidized or free services to users. In fact, They are making money essentially by enabling advertisers to reach their target audience more quickly by selling freely provided information on their users that can help predict their future activities. See Doge. Zuboff in 2019 has described this as the creation of a behavioral surplus, since it is virtually costless to the platform company to collect, process, and share such data by using increasingly sophisticated machine learning and algorithms. The fees they charge to advertisers are included in GDP figures, but the information freely provided by users is not. Overall, the rise of platform capitalism constitutes a key element of the contemporary rentierization process. What makes this specific sector unique as compared to other rentier sectors is that firms within it have increasingly dominated the circulation of products and information, enabling them to extract rents via the monetization of freely given information from consumers, and by charging producers a fee for the use of their increasingly monopolistic platforms, bearing down on their profits. That's trying to allow FedEx to get USPS's data, for example. Whilst this value extraction process may not result in a higher aggregate price level, the restructuring of overhead costs may well increase the rent share at the expense of the wage and profit shares, triggering stagnation, scenarios 1 and 2 in Section 3, in the long term. Given the recent emergence of digital technology platforms, a research program is needed to test these hypotheses empirically in this sector, perhaps more than any other. Number 5, conclusion and discussion. Yes, we're ready to stop. As Marx noted on the necessity of a theory of economic rent, without this, our analysis of capital would not be complete. The aim of this paper was to provide a more sophisticated understanding of modern economic rents and a roadmap for future research on rents at a time when there is widespread concern that capitalism has become, quote unquote, rigged in favor of an ever smaller business and financial elite. Who'd have thunk? We have argued that the dominant mainstream theoretical and policy approach to economic rents focused on prices being pushed above equilibrium levels is of limited use in understanding modern developments, as it overlooks the fact that rentierization can induce income redistribution between factors of production, capital, labor, and land, without price increases. So the disconnection between value and price. We have defined economic rent as income earned in excess of the reward corresponding to the contribution of a factor of production to value creation. This can be due to the ownership and exploitation of a scarce asset, the creation of monopolistic conditions in a particular sector, or policy decisions that favor directly or indirectly a specific group or interest. Now, this definition can be seen to encompass the dominant, that is, in policy circles, mainstream approach, which views rents as the differential between actual and equilibrium price caused by market imperfections. Now, adapting a Kalecki-inspired market pricing approach, we have demonstrated that rising rents drive up overhead costs and lead to a redistribution of income between factors of production, rather than necessarily to rising final goods prices. Our hypothesis is that when rentier intermediate sectors come to dominate the economy, wages and investment in productive activity and innovation tend to decline, leading to rising inequality and economic stagnation. We then examine modern economic rents in a number of key sectors and consider how they affect the overhead costs of productive firms and households. These included land, finance, natural resources, patents, corporate governance, and the digital sector. This mapping exercise, whilst limited in scope and depth, demonstrates how rentier sectors have come to dominate some of the most important areas of the economy. The consequence is that the cost structure of the economy is elevated to an artificially high level, with some forms of economic rent threatening our economic and social well-being, land rents rendering housing unaffordable in cities, our physical existence, non-renewable resource rents, and our democratic right to access vital information without imposed barriers, digital rents. Whilst the classicals identified landowners as the key rentier class and Keynes targeted the financial sector, our reviews suggest that contemporary rentierism is a pervasive phenomenon, with different rent extraction business models existing in different sectors and social classes with diverse interests. This complements recent efforts to redefine notions of class, given the increasing importance of asset ownership to opportunity. For example, middle class households invest in housing as a financial asset, either enjoying windfall capital gains as primary residences are typically not taxed, or rising ground rents if they become landlords. By taking an Uber taxi ride or ordering a good on Amazon, we as consumers are supporting and benefiting from a digital rent extraction model that may lead to job losses and stagnating demand. The dynamics likely will make policy reform challenging as the identification of interests across socioeconomic groups becomes more complex and diverse coalitions between middle income households and elite rentiers form. Yes, well, will we get that? That's an interesting question. This paper hopefully opens a new research agenda focused on better defining and mapping modern economic rents beyond the dominant mainstream paradigm, and in doing so, developing policies better equipped to deal with them. Further research should naturally seek to empirically test how different overhead cost structures influence investment, innovation, and wages in the context of economies with different institutional structures due to varying property and legal rights. In order that policy proposals that come out of this are realistic, more in depth case study research is also needed to flesh out rentier business models in greater detail. This applies not least to the digital sector, where new kinds of rentier business models are becoming increasingly significant at both national and international levels. Now, that's the end of the Mazzucato et al. Article, but I think this suggests far more deeper policy conversations. Has excellent references in here. And the second article I will not start because I've run out of time, but Michelle Boldrin and David Levine deals with this in a slightly more mathematical way, but they come to pretty much the same conclusion. There's that innovation gets stifled by rent seeking, and inevitably, the intellectual property protection should be not constrained or organized by the state, or if they are organized by the state, they must be highly liberal. So that's the spoiler, I guess. The whole business is that it's not going to it rent is bad. Anyway, thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop the share, go to stop the live